are very fortunate to have one of the great leaders here in Silicon Valley to share with us some of his insights. And Pat Gelsinger not only ran one, but he ran two of the most significant companies that are here in driving innovation and technology. But in his spare time, he founded a faith movement that was designed to transform Silicon Valley. That's kind of Pat in a nutshell. He's part technologist, part CEO, part spiritual architect. But one thing he's all in on purpose. His career is like a highlight film of modern computing. He helped engineer the early days of the personal computer. He steered VMware into the cloud era, and more recently led Intel into the future of AI and its global growth. But what makes Pat remarkable isn't what he's built, it's how he builds. In a world obsessed with speed and disruption, he leads with conviction, humility, and rock-solid values. He's proof that you can thrive in Silicon Valley without losing your soul, that you can scale companies and character, and still make it home for dinner. A trailblazer in technology, a force in faith, and a masterclass in what it means to lead with purpose. Well, please welcome Pat Gelsinger.
All right, now, being the speaker after the speaker on public speaking, not a great place to be, or the speaker before lunch, but we'll give it a whirl. What do you think? Okay, let's do this. So, thanks, Mark. It's great to be here, and impressive room of people, and people who, in every way and everywhere, incredibly successful. And when I'm in a room like this, I think about that word, moonshots. Oh, by the way, where'd the clicker go? There it is. Thank you. Okay, good. Now we're okay. Now we're ready to go. All right, moonshots. When I'm in a room like this with people like this, moonshots. Moonshots, audacious goals, things that are just frickin' impossible until they're not. And my moonshot as I began my journey is very much around some of the opportunities to create technologies that fundamentally change the world, right? And, we'll talk a little bit more about mine, but before we get there, I wanted to tell a little bit of my story. And I'm a farm kid from Pennsylvania. So, if you go to Reading, Pennsylvania, and you get on the road to Hershey, Pennsylvania, there's a podunk town between it, had one stoplight called Robizonia. We lived 5 miles outside of town, right? So when you got to nowhere in Pennsylvania, we were 5 more miles. And I accidentally, I thought I was going to be a farmer. My dad was number 9 of 10 kids. He never had his own farm. Had he had his own farm, I'd be farming in Pennsylvania today. Accidentally took a scholarship exam when I was 16 years old. You weren't supposed to take it until you graduated from high school. I didn't know that. I happened to win. So I ended up skipping my last year and a half of high school and finished my associate's degree. Intel came recruiting at 18 years old, and they offered me a trip to California. Ooh. I had never been on an airplane before, so hopped on the plane, fly out to California. And, this was just like, magic, right? California, Silicon Valley, the opportunity, to be part of this incredible thing. The first time when I touched the computer, I was hooked. I could write a program, and that thing did what I told it to do, if it didn't have any bugs, right? I was just, so infatuated with computing that this was what I wanted to do. Being this young technician at, I started as a Tech 2 at Intel. Right, that's like one rung above janitor, barely, right? Just at the rock bottom of starting there. But, when I came into Intel, I thought I was entering the Holy of Holies, right? It's just, the place that invented, the integrated circuit, the microprocessor, and I got to be part of that incredible journey. And over the last 45 years, 45 years in technology, can you believe that? Right, I started when I was 2. No, it was 18. But 45 years in technology. And have any of you ever used USB? Okay. Yeah, okay. I helped create it. When my granddaughter plugs in a USB stick, she says, "Thank you, Papa." Oh. Right? Yeah, I helped to create Wi-Fi. Any of you ever use Wi-Fi? Yeah, let me tell you about the battle for spectrum allocations and everything associated with it. Helped create the personal computer. I led 14 generations of microprocessors for Intel, cloud computing, just, so many of these seminal things, right? These are the founders of Intel, right? Starting at Intel at 18 years old, growing up at the feet of Gordon Moore, Moore's Law, Robert Noyce, the inventor of the integrated circuit, Andy Grove, we'll talk more about him. These were, like the trinity of Silicon Valley, and they were my mentors. I started there so young, I went through puberty at Intel, right? It was just, such an incredible experience. And my moonshot was work on a piece of technology that improved the life of every human on the planet. What do you think? Is that a moonshot? Yeah, that's a moonshot. But I want to ask you, do you have any moonshots? Right? Anybody here? You have a moonshot? Right? Some crazy idea? Yeah, come on. Right, this audience here, let's try it. Okay, back here. How about a moonshot back here? Crazy big. Yeah, you raised your hand, didn't you? No? Okay, now she's afraid. Okay, we'll skip that. Moonshot right here in the front.
Richard Hall, and I want to make sure athletes worldwide have know how to transfer the intangibles into careers through experiences, career experiences.
What do you think? Is that a good moonshot? Good. Now, Oliver, right, and what's your name again? Richard, right? I'm giving you a copy of a book. We'll talk a little bit more about the book later. And I would just say, think about what your moonshot is. You're athletes, you're successful. What are the things that you're going to do to truly change the world? And, as you think about technology, and I've had this extraordinary, picture, right, of technology. Any of you use technology today? Yeah, okay, yeah, right, just think about a day without technology, right? But, I'd also ask you to think, is there any good or bad to technology? What do you think? Is technology good? Okay. Is it bad? Okay, some of you can't decide. Okay. And I will argue technology neutral. It's neither good nor bad, right? It has to be shaped for good. Roman roads, were they good or bad? Good? They were military. It was out to conquest the world. Was that good? Right? Destroy other nations? Right? Good or bad? I would also argue that's why Christ came when he did. The Pax Romana, the word could go out to change the world. Right? Was the printing press good or bad? Well, okay. What do you say? Good? Yeah, Chris, why was the printing press good? Help increase communications, right? Sounds pretty good, but it was also used for propaganda. And if you read some of the early days of the printing press, right, the Roman Empire was, they were, the church was arguing against it, right? Those printers, they do crappy work. You should only listen to a Vatican certified speaker, right? It was also bad, right? Going on, right? It could print Bibles or it could print pornography. Right? These technologies that have shaped the world, it is up to us to shape them as a force for good, right? Nuclear energy, was it good or bad? Again, technologies are neutral. We shape them for good. And my moonshots are to work on these technologies, to be constantly shaping them as a force for good. Right, and as we think about these technologies, I've worked on mainframes and PCs, helped to do the foundations of the internet and cloud computing and now AI. Think about some of the examples of how these waves of technology are influencing humanity. And the power of technology is each of these waves builds on the prior wave. So for instance, today, you're seeing the pictures of how rapidly ChatGPT is rising in the world. Well, that's because we've already connected 60% of humanity through the internet, which was already building on computing, which was already touching 20% of humanity. Each one is building on the other, so all of a sudden you can have multiple billion people coming on chat. Each wave is bigger than the last and allows it to occur. So I would just say, think about technology in this context of what it allows us to do. Now, My wife and I were very philanthropic. We have, all sorts of things that we're involved in, about a dozen major philanthropies that we're associated with. One of them happens to be Missions of Hope in Africa. When we started working with them almost 30 years ago, it was about 200 kids. Today, we have 32,000 kids in our schools. Isn't that awesome? Yeah. And these are the most impoverished kids on the planet, right? Literally out of slums, right? All in extreme poverty. Less than $6 per week of income into their families. Now, let me give you, 3 points and then one moonshot. Today, about 60% of humanity is connected over the internet. That's expected to hit 90% in 2030. 90% of every human on the planet is connected by the end of this decade. And that next 30%, almost all of it is the poverty-stricken nations. Well, that's pretty cool, isn't it? So literally, we're going to connect the most unconnected, the most in need. Second, with the power of AI, we are now going to conquer language. Today, about 200 languages are well served, right? How many of you use Google Translate? Yeah, okay. About the top 200 languages. Almost everybody living in poverty is in the next 7,000 languages. With the power of AI, we will conquer every language over the next decade. And, right, we'll be able to have personalized AI agents for every student on the planet. So I believe over the next decade, we will be in a position to educate every single child on the planet. What do you think? Of the 900 million people living in poverty, right, of the 900 million people living in poverty today, 300 million of those are kids. 300 million of those kids do not have access to education today. If we educate them, I believe that is the single most powerful thing that we can do to end poverty on our planet. And I believe in the next 10 years, through the power of technology, connectivity, AI, teacher productivity, we will educate every kid. Is that a moonshot? Amen, yeah. But today's talk isn't about my moonshots. It's about your moonshots, right? It's about what you can do, how each one of you can be challenged. And when we think about, this period of time, for instance, with AI, right? How many of you have heard of things called net neutrality? Any of you hear of that? Right? The basic, framework for the internet, right? This idea that you could have free carriage. Do you know who helped write the initial net neutrality laws? Me. Were they good or bad? Not clear, because now the social network providers don't have culpability for the media that goes over their network. So I'd say the first 10 years of what I did was really good for the internet. The last 10 years, not so good. So are we going to make AI good or not? Up to us, right? And the potential for us to be shaping AI as this force for good. As we think about that, we've also, one of the hats that I wear today, oh, sorry, I went too fast. Let's go back. Let's stay on this page a second longer, sorry. And when you think about AI, right, in that regard, will it be good or bad? Good? What do you think? How many of you got smarter today because of AI? Right? If not, why not? Right? It's incredible the things that you can do. But also, AI, does it hallucinate? Right? Will it be shaped based on values? One of the things that I'm driving today is called the technology for a company called Glue, building faith and flourishing technology for the faith ecosystem. We just released what we call the FAI benchmarks. There was a research work over the last 5 years, by that Eastern school, Harvard, right, Baylor, and Gallup, to define human flourishing, the 7 dimensions of human flourishing. And how do you define human flourishing, right? It's now defined very specifically: characters, wellness, right? What each one of it leads to human flourishing. And we now are driving benchmarks to say, are the AI models good? Do they produce answers that are consistent with human flourishing? right? And that's what we're off working on, right? Shaping technology as a force for good. And for each one of you in the technology industry and pursuit, I challenge you, are you working to help shape technology as a force for good? Lead it to be better every day. Because the only thing that really matters as you're pursuing your moonshot is, are you pursuing it, in a way that brings about human flourishing, that you touch and improve the lives of every person that you come in contact with. So a few pieces of career advice. My first one to you is mentors. I like to say, each one of you are diamonds in the rough. Okay? Is a diamond in the rough a good thing? You're pretty rough, right? You need some people to knock those edges off. And I would challenge each one of you, find them, listen to them, make them part of what makes you better each day. Now, a story of one of my career mentors, Andy Grove, that's pictured here. And I was giving an update. I was in charge of finishing the 83-86 program, and I'm giving an update to the executive team of Intel. And in the front row was Gordon Moore and Andy Grove and Bob Noyce are sitting in the front row. And, right, being this precocious young engineer as I was, I chewed them out. Yeah, what do you think, right? I was like, 22-year-old kid. If you don't fix my computers, I can't get my chip done, and you screwed it. I was just like, on fire, right? A couple days later, my phone rings, and I pick it up. Who is it? And the phone, the voice comes back, Andy. Andy who? I didn't want to be interrupted, Andy Grove. At that point, I'm panicking. Dweeb engineer speaking to the founder of the company. And Andy starts shelling me with questions. What do you read? What are you studying? What are your career objectives? And just start, and I was so beside myself, I barely could answer, much less give a competent response. He said, lousy answers. Be in my office in a week with better ones. Right? If the president says to be in his office in a week with better ones, what do? You leave the country or you show up. And mentoring with Andy, and that began a mentoring relationship that lasted literally till just before he passed away 5 years ago. Mentoring with Andy was like going to the dentist without Novocaine. He was tough, he was hard, he was brutal, right, on you, but he made me better. A few years ago, a few years after this began, I was in a event, and his wife Eva was there, and I came up and I said, why is Andy so hard on me, right? Because I thought he was, pretty soft on other people, but me, man, he just beat the snot out of me, right? He says that's because he loves you a lot, right? Sometimes maybe you don't want to be loved that much, right? For it. But so I asked one of you, how many of you have mentors? Okay, how many of you have real mentors that are making you better? Tell me about your mentor. Who was over here? Raise your hand again. Right? Tell me about your mentor. Right.
There you go.
Okay, give him a book too.
He's just a family friend who owns his own business, and he's always somebody to go to when I have a tough life decision to make. He's always got some really good advice for me on how to make the best decision possible.
Uh-huh. Does he challenge you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? Does he drive you to be better?
Yeah, he sets a great example too.
Yeah, and I would just challenge each one of you to have those kind of people in your life, those people that are making you better, right? And if they're too kind to you, they're probably not really good mentors, right? You're not looking for, hurrah, right? You're looking for refinement. You're looking for improvement, for depth of character. Every successful person I've known has had mentors like that, right? And if you want to be everything that God made you to be, you will have those kind of mentors in your life, people that are driving you to make you better. This is a picture of Gordon Moore and I saw him just a few weeks before he passed away. Moore's Law, the founder of Silicon Valley. John Hennessy, if you do that, president here of Stanford University, he was my thesis advisor. Right, we just had a Veritas conference a couple of months ago here, where he and I were, speaking together in it. You will have people like this that are making you better, that are taking that diamond in the rough, everything that God created you to be, and knocking off those rough edges. And those rough edges, they don't feel very good. But as you start to become that full diamond, what a powerful place to be. Next is passion. Build your moonshots around those things that you're passionate about, something you're good at, what you love doing. Do it with people you enjoy. And I'm 45 years into my career, and I'm still fired up, like I'm that 18-year-old kid walking into the halls, of Intel. And they call it work for a reason. You're going to have crappy days. How many of you have ever had a crappy day in the workplace? Yeah, and if you haven't raised your hand, stop lying, right? This is a place to be vulnerable and direct, right? You'll have those bad days, but your passions are what carry you through those bad days. December of last year, right, as I left Intel, that was one of the worst days of my career. One of the most difficult times, right? Transition, not being able to finish the vision that I had, and I'm still processing it. Some days, my wife would say, "How are you today?" Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I was pissed off, angry, and bitter. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday, God's on the throne and in control, and there's a good story here. So is it a Monday or a Tuesday, right? Well, I'm having more Tuesdays now instead of Mondays. But still those hard periods, and your passions need to drive you through it. And, those periods of time are when you actually grow. And I will argue for a second, that you don't grow in success. How many of you have been successful? Okay? How many of you have ever won a football game? A lot of you football players. Remember that? So what did you do after a football game? You went out and partied the night before, right? You stayed up too late. You ate too much. You did things that you weren't proud of. And when you showed up for practice the next day, what'd you do? You were a lazy bum, right, in practice the next day. Success made you worse, Chris, right? Failure. If you lost the game, when you showed up to practice the next day, what did you do? You were focused. Man, you were working hard. You were getting better. And I will argue that success is anti-growth. Because you look past all those things because, I was good. Failure is when you grow. You introspect. You learn. You put it on the table, right? You're ready to chew on it. But the thing that we do often in failure is we shove it in the closet, lock the door, and get that chapter behind us. Absolutely not. Put it on the table with those people that can give you feedback, work on it with you, chew on it with you. Failure, challenge, change. That is where you grow and succeed. And that's where that voice of Andy in the back of my head would just come ringing through. Because even when I was successful, he was always pushing me to be better, just like that coach, right? Who's just pushing you harder to be better. And that voice of Andy, right? Because even in some of my biggest successes with him, he was still pushing me in the areas I could have been better. He loved me a lot. Put your failures on the table. Ask yourself, how do I get better in my success? But especially, how do I get better in my failures? So, how many of you have failed at something? Okay, tell me about your failure. Yeah, you raised your hand, so.
I've lost a few murder trials over the years and figure out a way to get better.
Well, and those hurt, didn't they?
They did, actually.
And you thought about them a long time, didn't you?
Both before and after, yeah.
Yeah. And, okay, give him a book here, Oliver. But, I challenge each one of you, and in the time and the breaks that you have today, right, your failures. Talk about your failures, because that's where your character was developed. That's where you learned and grew. And finally, and most importantly, it's about relationships, right? And this is something that I struggled in my career with. I was like a prima donna my first 20 years at Intel. If you worked for me, you loved it. If you worked next to me, you hated it, right? Because, my project was the only thing that mattered, right? Being successful was the only thing that mattered. But none of us go this alone. People beside you are the ones that allow you to go far. The people that are with you allow you to be success. The stranger who becomes a partner, a longtime friend. Relationships aren't the side story. They are the story of your career journey and your life. Now, how many of you have managed your relationships well over your life? Okay, all of them? No, think back over them. And, but often, right, it's our relationships that suffer in the journey. The book that we're handing out, the Juggling Act, right, it was written, in my challenge years. I'm working full-time, going to school full-time, having a family. My wife had some medical issues, so we started the family like a decade before I was planning on it. So young kids and a family, and it became the thesis of the Juggling Act. How do you make it work? And any of you living in that period of time where there's just so many demands crushing in on you, how do you make it work? Right? And the book talks about some of the things that we did, things like dating my kids. We had 4 kids. I would take them for breakfast once a week, starting when they were 4 years old. So 4 kids every month, I was hitting one of them. 40 years later, guess what I'm doing this weekend? Taking one of my boys to breakfast, just like I've been doing for 40 years. How many of you are dating your spouse or significant other? Particularly in those years, you're just crushed, man. You can't even remember the last time you went on the date, right? Kids and work and projects and so on. Continue dating your spouse, investing. We had what we called the at-home chart, right? It was keeping score. I'm a goal-oriented guy, right? Someone like that. So, if I was home by 5, that was 2 points. Home by 6, that was 1 point. Home after that, 0 points. Gone on the weekend, negative points. My secretary would produce the score for Linda and I, my wife, as an independent arbiter. Everybody needs a referee, right, an umpire, right, every week, the at-home start, right? You got to work at it in this period of time to keep those relationships, and particularly the most important ones, your family, your spouse, your kids, alive and well in that period of your life journey. It's the relationships that matter when you come to the end. And it's the only way that you will finish your audacious moonshots if, in fact, you've brought those relationships on the journey. Let me finish my time by telling you one of the most powerful lessons I've ever seen on the value of relationships. In 1985 in Geneva, it was the International Telecommunications Union event. And this is like the posh of posh. Right? World leaders are there. Almost all of the UN 200 countries are there. Flags and dancers and everything like that. And there were 3 keynote speakers for ITU 1995. Andy Grove, Nelson Mandela, and Kofi Annan. What do you think? That's a pretty good trio. And guess what I was doing? I was Andy's +1. So here I am, rubbing shoulders with Kofi Annan, Nelson Mandela, and Andy in the green room. What a cool thing, huh? Any of you topped that one for famous people you met? Okay, so maybe you have, but I'll challenge you with a few others. But here we are in the green room, and at this point in time, Nelson Mandela is at the peak of the world visibility. Right? He has just led apartheid. He's become the president of South Africa. He's on every newspaper, every magazine cover, at the peak of his leadership and influence in the world. And here I am. There's 6 of us in the green room, right? The 3 speakers and the +1s of each room. So here I am sitting right next to Nelson Mandela. A little black man comes, probably almost 70 years old, white gloves on, and he's serving coffee to the speakers. And here's Nelson Mandela is not looking at his notes, right? He's not hobnobbing with Kofi Annan, maybe the most viable, visible UN leader, or with Andy Grove. Do you know what Nelson Mandela is doing? He's talking to that little black man. Tell me your story. Tell me about your kids. Tell me about what's important to you. Tell me about your family. Tell me about your goals. Because you see, the journey of life, it's not about who notices you. It's about who you notice on the journey. So I just want to leave you with these questions today. What are your moonshots? What are those big, audacious goals that you're just going to dedicate yourself to? And 30 and 40 years from now, you're going to be on this stage telling the incredible things that you've been able to accomplish. Second, do you have your mentors? Your Andy Groves. Those people that are just making you better, and if not, go do it. And third, how will those moonshots then ripple across, humanity? How can we work together to make those moonshots possible? As Robert Noyce used to say, go out and do something wonderful, right? In a room of leaders like this, do things that truly are going to change the world. And those audacious goals, they just seem impossible today. A decade or two later, just like Nelson Mandela said, it's impossible until it's done. Thank you very much. And we have a few more books if you want to come up and grab some of them. Number 2, pardon?
I think there's 15 minutes for questions.
We have some
Yeah.
questions if you're willing.
Oh, yeah, sure. Let's do questions. Yeah. And number 2, right, we're also starting a study that I'm going to be doing. Oliver Roll is listed up here. If you grab that, I'll be doing every 2 weeks a Bible study and leadership study. If anybody wants to join, just reach out to Oliver, and we'll be starting that up in September. So, time for Q&A.
Thank you, Pat, again for your time. My name is Jordan. I have a 2-part question. This morning we've talked a lot about culture and the importance for an organization to have the right culture. The first part of the question is, recently I read John Doerr's book, Measure What Matters, and he talks about OKRs.
Yeah, he screwed up parts of it, but anyway, it's a good book nonetheless.
No worries. Given your mentorship with Andy, can you speak to those? And then the second part is, leading such a big organization, there was a big merger a couple years ago, Dell and EMC. Can you speak to your experience going through that and really meshing 2 different cultures in that instance?
Yeah, and in many, let me start with the last one, right? The cultures, because it was actually 3 cultures. It was Dell, EMC, and VMware, right? And I was running VMware, so in the seat associated with it. And mergers, one of the biggest failing points of most mergers is culture, right? And it doesn't matter, and this applies, so on in life, right? Right, anytime you bring 2 organizations together, maybe it's blended families. These things are different, right? All those little things are different. And, Dell was a very, top-down hierarchical. EMC was a very sales-oriented culture. VMware was a software tech maniac, out-of-control kind of culture, and merging those together, oh my. And my advice to any of you who are in those situations is pick the few things, the very few things that matter for the merger, and don't sweat the rest. Let them work out over time, right? Because cultures don't change quickly. Values don't change quickly. Pick the few you're going to make a big deal about, and everything else, just slowly work those things to bring those together over time. But, because you try to force too many things early, it is like organ rejection. It just explodes. And at a couple points in the middle of that merger, I remember one particularly fun board meeting where I am screaming at my board chair, right? That's not becoming of a CEO to be screaming at your board chair in a board meeting. It just let you know that's not a good behavior. So that was not my finest day, but a lot of emotion and attention around that situation associated with it. On OKRs, mentoring, Door, and Grove, it really is, some of the, and as I mentioned, every person of great influence and impact can always look back and say, man, this person touched me. I had 5 significant mentors in my career. Only one is still with us today. Still speak with them every Friday. Pour into those relationships. Things like OKRs and objectives and so on. Those things that just seem so simple and yet consistently done over time become so powerful in organizations and the ability to scale and have good process and success. And to this day, some of those conversations with Andy still ring in the back of my mind.
Matt, and I just graduated college, so it really hits me hard when you start talking about finding a career that you're passionate about.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips to really try to find because you mentioned how find something you're good at, which is meaningful, and I love doing. So maybe could you provide some more tips along those lines?
Yeah, and obviously, particularly early in your career, you may not have it right yet, right? I'll just say, I knew the second I touched a computer, that's what I wanted to do, right? It was just like, click, and the rest, everything else sort of followed from that. Some of you may have to wander a while. And the wandering is fine, moving laterally through different careers because, moving into a different area, you have two things to learn. That's not the area you want to do, or it gets you closer to the area you do want to be part of. I often think about careers as T's, right? And, the T, the vertical axis is be deep in something. An area that you're really good at, really capable at, brings value, has unique contribution in, and the T is be broad. One of the early mentoring sessions with Andy, he challenged me because I was an engineer's engineer, right? And the only things that I read were technical papers and, journals and so on. I was a T, right? But no top. So Andy challenged me to read the Wall Street Journal before every time that we came, and I had to tell him something I read in the Wall Street Journal from a field not my own and its relevance to what I was working on. You have to get broad. When I was president at EMC, I met with a board member every board meeting, and I meet with Jack Egan, and he was the E in EMC was his dad. And I said, Jack, how am I doing? And Jack said, well, Pat, two things. One is, we're an East Coast company. You need to dress like an East Coast company. Okay, Linda, we're going to Nordstrom's tonight, right? Second thing is corporate finance. If you're ever going to run this place, you need to learn more about corporate finance. EMC got me a Columbia professor finance coach, and he coached me on corporate finance for a year. My wife and I are on summer vacation that year. We're on a cruise boat. She's reading some, Christian romance novel. I'm reading the 1,100-page corporate finance textbook, and we're both loving it. T, you have to get broad. And as you move up in leadership, you need more experiences, and particularly when you get to be CEO, right? You need to go to the engineering school, you need to go to the law school, the marketing school, everything else. But you know where you spend all of your time? The psychology department. Learning to work with people.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. Really appreciated it. In terms of AI, and you said, we'll
By the way, anybody who asks a question, come to the end and we'll give you a book. I would have given them all to you, but we ran out of them. So
I look forward to reading it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You said AI will conquer every language in a very kind of positive sense.
Yes.
I tend to see that in the Roman road analogy where, there was potentially a negative aspect. And I kind of see it already eroding our human writing skills and language skills. And just curious, your perspective, someone your granddaughter's age, how AI will, help and not inhibit the writing and the human language skills. And thank you so much for your talk and your perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, and every piece of technology has that kind of question associated with it. So let's just do a little exercise now and just say, I should not use a computer to do math, okay? Because it's going to degrade my math skills, right? You agree with that, right? Right? And if you would imagine you would go to an accountant and he says, no, I'm just doing double ledger manual entry of your tax records. What do you think? Would you use that accountant very long? Absolutely not, right? Right? So in many regards, it changes the nature, right, of what's important and what's valuable in skills. Do we still need to teach writing, arithmetic, read? Of course, right? But it's in the context of these new tools, these new capabilities. I was giving a talk at university recently. We had a couple thousand in the room, parents, faculty, and students. I asked, how many of you have cheated using, chat? And a handful of quizzical, hands went in the air. And I then said, why haven't the rest of you cheated using AI tools? Right? It's the best tool available, right? You have to learn how to use these new tools if you're going to be competitive, economic, and viable in the next age. Studies have shown that new technologies, they destroy jobs, but for every job they destroy, they create 1.5 jobs. right? Remember, a web manager used to be somebody who used to clean webs out of attics, right? Right now, I mean, it's just this constancy of innovation. And I truly believe, that's what I mean, AI is a force for good, technology as a force for good. Collectively, we have to be embracing it, learning it, using it, upgrading our skills with it, but also shaping it as good, because we risk losing things, right? In the social networking era, you'd have 3 teenagers sitting on a couch texting each other, right? They lost human relationship. How abysmal. We are humans created to be in relationships. So we have to constantly be saying, how do we make it good for our children and grandchildren? But that, these forces of technology, they are coming. How do we embrace them, make them good, use them effectively?
Hello. So I was wondering, everyone talks about having a great mentor. How do I become a great mentee? How do I foster that? How do I, deal with that unilateral effect of they're teaching me something when I can't really gain or give to them?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is, first, right, how do you get a great mentor? So let's practice here a little bit. I met Chris here in our little name exchange before. Chris, I'm impressed by your life. I'm impressed by the skills that you have, how you've led your journey of life. I want to learn. Can I just buy you coffee and talk to you about some of the things I would want to learn? Now at this point, Chris ain't been this, he has not been this well complimented in like decades, right? Right, at that level, right? Second, I'm showing an earnestness, and I'm going to give him specificity of the areas that I want to grow in, right? The things that he has in his life that I want to benefit from. And great mentors, they give you advice, they don't give you direction, right? And your job as a mentee, next time I come to Chris, Chris, last time we talked about A, B, and C. I thought hard about A, and I am doing it. Thank you so much. I thought hard about B. I'm not going to do it for the following reasons, but that was really helpful input, made me think about it much better. And number C, I need to talk to you more about it today. Now, Chris views his investment. People like to help people. Chris views this investment into my life as a meaningful use of his time. I am taking it seriously. I'm using the inputs that he's given me. I'm remembering. I'm coming back, doing good work on it. I'm a good mentee that he wants to invest his life into. Chris, what do you think? You going to keep me as a mentor?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, one final question. Here we go.
Actually, 2 more, if I may.
2 more? Sure.
There's one here and then one here at the front.
You lost control. Sorry, Mark.
Should I start? Yeah. We talked
Wants
about
to eat, Pat.
Yeah, okay. That's okay. Sorry.
We briefly mentioned net neutrality and how important it was to rely on that structure and framework during the ages up into this point in technology.
Yep.
I was maybe a bit more inside baseball, but wanted to ask you, what governance changes or regulatory changes do you think are important that we address now for this new age of technology and how integral that's becoming?
Yeah, so peeling the onion a little bit, Craig Mundy, he was the CTO at Microsoft, I was the CTO at Intel. I can remember it like yesterday. I'm sitting in my office on a Saturday morning, I'm late for my son's soccer game. We are finishing the draft of the 4 net neutrality principles. Those went to the FCC, that then pounded them into the net neutrality legislation that became the 320 laws. Right, and that governed, essentially decade and a half of the, expansion and creation, of the open carriage of the internet. Super powerful, period of time. But it did not address the need for any basis by which the people that are carrying or running their businesses on the internet are culpable for the content on the internet. Now, if you think about FCC and you're on Spectrum, I say something libelous to you on the air, I'm liable for what I say, right? And the stations, right? You'll hear them, right? We're not covering any responsibility for what may be said on the station and all that kind of stuff. Okay, who is legally responsible for crap, right? Who carries, that? And if that's not thought through, okay, now you have, well, whatever goes on in the social network, there is no accountability, for it. There is no legal framework. And I believe this could easily be addressed. And I've met with senators and talked about this, of how this could be better addressed. But now we have the next opportunity, because all of search, all of social will be usurped by AI and large language models. It will destroy the social networking business models and create new ones in its place. And here I say is, are the models good? Are they consistent with our values, right? And who, right, is responsible for assuring content licensing, association first, right, article rights of, content protection, and who is liable for ill use or for failures of the, technology system. Those need to be accounted for as we're establishing, the next phase of technology, with AI. And they can be, right? We've done it before, but in this period of time. So let's do a little thought experiment here. Imagine, I'm releasing a great new drug, right? Alex, we're releasing a great new drug, right? 50% of the people have great results from it, right? 40% of the people get sick from it, and 10% of the people die. Should I release the drug? No, the engineering ain't done, right? From it. And I think we have to view this next phase of technology. If it isn't good, right? If it's hallucinating, if it leads you to bad places, is it inconsistent with human values? Remember, the models themselves are putting this in place. And if lots of people have ill results from them, it's not done. The engineering isn't finished. Don't release the autonomous vehicle. It's hitting people. Don't release the drug. It's killing people. We need that same kind of requirement on the creation of the next generation of technology. Yeah. Okay. Is it a good question?
It's a great one, but the question before last, you answered it, so.
Oh, so we are done. Okay.
That's great.
Hey, thank you so much.
Hey, Pat, that's awesome.